So Jeff asked me to talk about the ways in which we know DIRFloortime works, which is a little different from what I usually do, which is just trying to figure out if it works.
And to answer the question, we have to think about how do we decide exactly what DIRFloortime is? And in particular, how is it different or how is it the same from other approaches to treating children with autism? And I sat down and started going through a number of things, and as I went through things that distinguish or seem to distinguish DIR, I had trouble. Because if you sort of look at the words and talk about what is DIR, well, everybody says, well, it's this developmental, relationships-based, individualized intervention. Well, I flip those around. We find that other approaches use many of those same words and those same strategies, for lack of a better word. So if we look at developmental, for example, DIR uses this set of stages for foundational capacities that you guys have probably heard ad nauseum by now. ABA has a developmental approach as well to some extent. They talk about foundational behaviors, so kids have to learn to sit before they can attend. Kids have to learn to make eye contact. Kids have to learn to mimic behaviors. Kids have to learn to point. And there's this developmental progression if you look at any ABA program. So these structured sequences of behaviors. And then we have this new thing that's come out just recently. A whole bunch of people have gotten together and published an article saying that really we should be talking about these things now, these NDBI approaches, and this stands for naturalistic developmental behavioral interventions, which is shorthand for throw everything together. And they talk a lot about developmentally appropriate practice. So they talk about play level, different levels of play. What's the first level and what's the next level? You maybe have parallel play, and then you have cooperative play, for example. Then you might have symbolic play. Same thing with different levels of speech. You know, you're at the one-word stage, and then you're at the two-word stage, and then you're maybe putting together syntactic constructions, right? And parents are actually taught to, if they are using parents or interventionists are actually taught to teach these behaviors one after the other. You have to do the first one, the second one, and the third one. So I'm not sure developmental really keys in this context. So individualized, well, DIR talks about you have to use individual strategies, different strategies for each child. You've seen one child with autism, you've seen one child with autism, right? Everybody says that, though. ABA does the same thing, right? There are different motivators. First thing you have to do when you're doing ABA, you have to analyze the child's behavior, see what's motivating the child, what's getting the child's attention, what can you use for reinforcers. That's individualized, right? And then these naturalistic developmental behavioral interventions use a combination of those two things. All right, well, what about the relationships-based part? Well, DIR talks about engagement. There's a lot of focus on coaching parents, attention to parent-child relationships, attention to parent-therapist relationship. Relationships between or among family members. Now we start getting a little bit different. ABA talks about eye contact as far as these relationships go. Learned facial expressions and phrases. So now we're really getting at something different here. And these naturalistic developmental behavioral interventions talk about engagement. They talk about, oftentimes, parent-mediated interventions. And they use strategies like ABA does above. So what I did, I couldn't really figure out exactly what the difference was. So being a scientist, I went a scientific route, and I did a study just for you guys, just for today. And I took the text of the Engaging Autism textbook, book, and I took the entire text of Ivar Lovaas's Me book, which is sort of the ABA Bible. So we've got the DIR Bible, and we've got the ABA Bible. And I fed these into a program, and what this did was find the most frequent words in each text. And here's what I come up with, this word cloud up here. And I think this is really interesting. What's nice to see when I look at both of these word clouds is that the word child is the most frequent word in both word clouds, right? So the way you read these word clouds is the bigger the text, obviously, the more frequent the word is. And then you start to see some things differing in terms of frequency of uses. You get this big behaviors up here in the ABA approach. You get interactively, emotions, problems, plays, big in the DIR approach. Teaching, objects, imitation, prompt, reward, these are big in the ABA approach. Okay? And it's not that these words don't ever appear. Well, some of these words never appear in each other's text, but for the most part, these words overlap to a great deal. What I did actually is I had to pull some numbers together, so I plotted the number of words each one was using. Brown is for the Me book, and red is for Engaging Autism, and you can see that there are some words that are very different between the two approaches. Engaging Autism never uses the word prompt. It doesn't use the word teaching. Interesting, right? It doesn't use the word rewards or imitation or correct. It does use ability, processing, challenges. Those are absent in ABA. Ideas, gestures, stages. Floor time, of course, is only in Engaging Autism. This one I'm very proud of, by the way. The word experiment appears 165 times, and Engaging Autism doesn't appear at all in the Me book. Surprising. I suspect that Stanley and Serena were using it in a slightly different way, but nonetheless, interesting. The word relationship shows up a lot. So what we end up with is something that looks like this, and half of it is off your screen, unfortunately. But that first column says interactive, think, ability, process, ideas, gestures, stage, floor time, sense, experiment, relationship, solving, and then you can see the rest of them there for DIR and compare that to what ABA has. Now we're starting to really develop and really get an idea of how these two approaches differ. And so I took the top 100, actually it's the top 50, I think, words that distinguished DIR from ABA. And these are the words that we come up with for DIR. So I think this word cloud really tells us what is DIR all about. So what I thought we would do in trying to decide what's the evidence base for DIR is look at some of these things here and see what's the evidence base for these things being important for child development and being important for autism treatment in general. So let's take the first group here, and I've just tried to group things together that seem to go together. So interests and interactive and plays and focus. I put these things together, and I think this comes down to saying that learning requires input. Nobody would argue with the fact that learning requires input, right? Unless you think that everything that you have to learn is innate and you don't have to learn it to begin with, which actually there are some theories out there that do that, but we'll ignore those theories. They should be ignored. And think about now, what do you learn through interaction and play? When you're an infant or when you're a child, how do you learn, right? People don't sit their children down and start using flashcards with them, right? Kids learn almost everything through interaction and through play. Your language, you learn that through interaction and play. What emotions are, what they do. Pragmatics. Pragmatics is things like learning that when you're a 3-year-old, mommy give me a cookie is probably not a good way to get a cookie as compared with mommy, can I have a cookie? Right? You have to learn that. Okay? And what's more interesting is that mommy, can I have a cookie? The correct response or the appropriate response is never yes and then not to give the child a cookie. Right? Kind of like if your father says, could you pass the salt? You don't say yes and then not pass the salt, right? Because you might not eat much more at that point. Okay? So we learn all of that through social interaction. We learn all of that through play. Think about other things, basic things like object permanence, the fact that objects don't disappear. Somebody doesn't sit you down and say, look what happens. I put this cloth over top of the object, and when I pick it up, it doesn't disappear. That's called object permanence. Got it? Or Understanding of object motion, right? All these things that Newton had to write things about, right? Objects at rest stay at rest unless acted on by an outside force. Kids as young as 2 years old have learned this, right? We can do experiments to see, do they pay attention when an object starts moving by itself without anybody moving it, right? Or if it doesn't continue on the same trajectory as we expected, it kind of all of a sudden changes trajectory. Kids think that's weird, okay? 2-year-olds think that's weird. Nobody tells them that. 1-year-olds don't think it's weird. 2-year-olds think it's weird, which suggests that they have to learn that at some point. How do they learn? They have to learn by experiencing the world. They have to learn through play. They have to learn through interaction. Mike Tomasello, who is a language researcher, he's also a primatologist at the Leipzig Max Planck Institute in Leipzig. He talks about, he wrote this really award-winning book, and he talks about the ratcheting effect. And the ratcheting effect is the fact that over successive generations, we learn what the previous generation knows, right? So it's possible, we know from studies of Nicaraguan sign language, it's possible to develop a language from nothing, right? So there's a home for the deaf in Nicaragua, and children were put into this home, and when they were found out they were deaf, they were not taught sign language, right? Nobody was taught anything. They were taken care of, they weren't neglected, but they weren't taught. It was decided, they can't speak, and nobody knew sign language who was running the thing, so they didn't teach them. What happened? They developed their own sign language. And it has continued to develop over the years. It's now been about, 30 years or so, and it keeps getting more complicated. At first, they didn't have words like I think or I know. They didn't have words for that. Now they do. They had to develop these sorts of things over time. So it is possible to develop your own language if you are giving nothing. But think about what a huge step up we have, given that we can learn from our parents or other people who speak the language. We can learn about those things, right? How do you learn about those things if you're not interacting with someone else? You can't, right? So you're at a huge disadvantage if you're not interacting. Learning from interaction does require attention. It requires focus. It requires motivation. You have to want to interact, right? So that's where play comes in. Play is fun. Kids like to do things that are fun. We all like to do things that are fun. We don't like to do things that are not fun. Right? If it's fun, we're more likely to pay attention to it. We're more likely to do it. If we're more likely to engage in more interaction is more input, more opportunities for learning. So that input is really, really important. Is there research? Is there empirical evidence to support this notion that input is gained through interaction and that we need this interaction to learn? I can't shout yes loud enough. There's so much, there's no way I could list it all. It would take, 42,000 slides for me to list as much. Just a few prominent researchers. Mike Tomasello has been publishing on this since the 80s. Roberta Golenkoff has been publishing since the 80s. She also has a lot of stuff on the importance of play and how important play is to our development of symbolic thinking and logical thinking. Elizabeth Bates, since the 70s, has been publishing, and Jerry Bruner, who's at NYU, has been publishing since the 50s on this stuff. There is a huge literature on this, right? That interaction is really, really important. The bottom line is that social interaction and play are absolutely critical. You can't do without them if you want kids to learn language, pragmatics, if you want them to learn about the world, general world knowledge, affordances, what do you do with objects, what are they for? You have to have that input. You can't do without it. You can't do without social interaction. All right, when I get to these slides, I'll always put an allied treatments slide in there, and I will make this slide show available. Jeff will upload it, and we'll put a bibliography at the end of it. And I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time after this point because the interventions keep showing up over and over again. But there's a group in England led by Green and Aldred, who work on this kind of thing, and they have shown a number of things about the importance of interaction. So, for example, they just published a study in The Lancet where they worked with parents of children at risk for autism and taught them different ways of interacting, basically improved their interaction skills And they found significant changes in infant attentiveness. The infants were more likely to attend to the parents. Their adaptive functioning improved. They found an overall decrease in the diagnosis of autism in this group that was at risk for autism. And they found less infant disengagement. So it was less frequent that infants turned away from the parents and tried to get away from parents. Casenhiser has an approach called JASPER, stands for joint, if I can remember this, joint attention, symbolic play, engagement, and regulation, another alphabet soup sort of a thing. And she focuses on interaction and joint attention and symbolic play. Brooke Ingersoll has done a number of studies that are similar to this, showing the importance of interaction. She doesn't really name hers, although she did do some work on impact, which I think is a precursor for PACT up here. And then there are these models like the Early Start Denver model, which is this hybrid naturalistic developmental behavioral intervention that also focuses on interaction and joint attention. CERTS looks at communication in general. All right, so but what about behaviorist approaches? Can't behaviorist approaches do the same thing? Can't you learn all this stuff, at a table? Can't somebody teach it to you? I talked about the ratchet effect. Isn't that what's going on when somebody's teaching you? Well, okay, possibly, but not practically, okay? It's really an insurmountable task, right? So think for a second. If I say this little guy up here, or if I don't say this little guy, if I point into this bottom right-hand corner and say, that's a moop, okay? Everybody knows you can identify a moop now, right? All right, how many people think a moop is that blue monster? Right, how many people think it's this orange thing in the middle of the blue monster? Why? Why would I think it's a stupid orange thing there? It's possible, right? It's possible that when I said that's a moop, I was indicating this little orange thing in the middle. It's not obviously a part of, well, you assume it's a part of the monster, but I could be naming this, just like I could have said eye. If I had said that's an eye, you would have thought it was this, right? Because that's a part of the monster and you know what an eye is already. But why do we assume when somebody points at something and says that's a moop that it indicates the entire object and not a part of the object? Did anybody ever sit you down and say, when somebody names an object, they're referring to the whole thing, not a part of it? How did you learn that? Now, it's just one example. Does anybody know of an ABA program that teaches that? It doesn't exist. How do you learn it? You learn it through social interaction. You learn it experiencing parents naming things for you and realizing that practically, pragmatically, it must refer to the whole object. If I want to name the individual parts of the object, I have to go to greater pains and say, it's this little part here. This is a moop. This is something else, but this is a moop, right? Pragmatics, right? You have to learn that through interaction. We learn it based on the input and based on the contingencies of the input that we get. Is it possible to teach that through ABA? Well, probably, but that's just one little thing, and there are, millions of other things that you would have to teach through an ABA program if that was going to work. I have a student who's taking an ABA class, one of my PhD students at the university, and she complained to the professor that ABA oftentimes results in kids having trouble with generalization, right, especially discrete trial training. And his answer was, that's because they're doing it wrong. And she said, well, what do you mean? And he said, well, they're not including enough of the different situations in which you might have to use that particular skill. And he's right. But how many situations are there? Right? You'd be there forever trying to teach all those different situations. Whereas if the child can learn from interactions, and if we think about, let's get the child to the point where they can learn from interactions, you don't have to worry about that because it's there in the natural interactions that you're already giving them. Okay, so thinks, capacities, cognitive, meaningful, processing, solving, purpose. This is another thing that's distinguishing, in particular with behavioral interventions. It really comes down to our understanding of the function of the behaviors. Behaviors are important. Is DIR a behavioral intervention? Well, yes, in the sense that we're trying to change kids' behavior. It's not, however, what's a behaviorist intervention. We're concerned with the behaviors, but that's really secondary to what's going on in their heads, right? And this is very different for an ABA, somebody who's approaching it from ABA, right? In fact, for ABA, cognitive processes are irrelevant, okay? It's not that they don't exist, right? Skinner, for example, says they do exist. Cognitive processes are real. It's just that they're irrelevant. We don't need them, right? We can define everything based on stimulus and response. That's all we need. Stimulus, response, everything in the middle is a black box. We can't see it. We can't measure it. Forget about it. Stimulus and response, okay? Meaning and purpose is defined that way, the relationship between the stimulus and the response. That's what function of language is, right? In fact, there's no such thing as language, actually, for a behaviorist, right? It's what? Verbal behavior. It's not language. It's verbal behavior. Well, what's meaning? That doesn't exist, because that's a thing in your head. We can't see that. There's no such thing as meaning. It's verbal behavior. There's nothing special about language. I need a collective gasp from the SLPs in the audience. Okay? There's no such thing as language, it's just verbal behavior. It's not special at all. It's the same as any other behavior, right? Okay, so cognitive processes do exist, right? And they do inform behavior, if not determine behavior. We can't ignore them, right? And so to paraphrase Noam Chomsky, I'll say, saying cognitive processes are irrelevant is like saying gravity and time are irrelevant. We can't measure directly gravity and time. You can't see time, you can't taste it, you can't touch it, you can't feel it. Does that mean that it's irrelevant? I wish. It'd be nice, right? All the time in the world, that would be great. Or it doesn't exist, right? But it is real. We can't ignore it. We have to pay attention to it, right? So the same thing for cognitive processes. They are real. We can't ignore them. We have to pay attention to them. We do need the behaviors. We have to measure the behaviors, but we can't ignore them. Okay, so the behaviorist approach is incomplete. Almost no one studies language or communication from a behaviorist perspective. In fact, the world-famous language researcher named Erica Hoff, she has a very popular textbook out, and she says in her textbook, she talks about a number of approaches to language learning and development. And she says all of these approaches are viable explanations of how language is learned, with the exception of behaviorism. Okay? Yet this is the approach that many people take. Okay? It works. Conditioning works. I can't say conditioning doesn't work. You reward a behavior, you'll increase the frequency. If you punish a behavior, you'll decrease the frequency. That happens. I just think you don't get the whole story if you don't think about the cognitive process. You run into problems. You teach the behaviors and you don't develop the cognitive processes. I'll give you a real quick example. There's an article in a well-known journal. And in the article, they talk about joint attention and autism, and they teach SMILE with coordinated gaze, right? Because joint attention is really important. We know there's lots of work showing if you increase joint attention, you increase development, you increase language abilities, okay? So they go through the process of measuring joint attention and smiling abilities to begin with, and they train them, and eventually what you see is, well, this is what they looked like to begin with, and this is after training. Joint attention and smiling, way better after training, right? Very clear in these graphs. But let's think about how they did the treatment. So the interventionist taught the child to smile in response to the command, smile. If the child did not smile, they tickled the child. After the child then smiled, they said, great smiling, and rewarded the child with an edible food or a toy. And then they faded that edible food or toys. And for looking, they did the same sort of thing. Wow, it's Elmo. If the child didn't look, they used the finger in front of the child's eye to trace toward the object so the child would follow their finger. And then again, they reinforced good looking. And then they combined the two. So now what you get after this is the child will look and smile at the same time. Problem solved. Right? Okay, but think about this, right? What's the purpose of joint attention? Okay, what do we use joint attention for? We have to understand what joint attention, what its purpose is. Right? Just getting someone to look at something or smile doesn't mean they're doing anything with that joint attention. And many of you have experienced that situation with children who have been taught to look, and they look sort of at the point on the wall behind, right through your head. They're not reading your gaze. They're not reading anything about what you're doing with your gaze. They have just been taught that I can't get anything accomplished if I don't look at the person, right? And now we just have that behavior, but we don't have any purpose for the joint attention, right? Okay, so joint attention is not synonymous with the behavior that's being measured, or I should say eye gaze is not synonymous with joint attention. Eye gaze is one way of measuring joint attention. Do we need to measure eye gaze? Sure. Is that the only way you can have joint attention? No. Can you attend to something without using eye gaze? Absolutely. Right? Certainly visually impaired individuals are able to attend to things without eye gaze. Okay? It gets a little bit harder to learn some things, right? It's hard to explain what the moon is, right, to a child who's visually impaired, but they can still attend to things, right? And you guys probably all have worked with children with autism who are attending way more than it looks like they're attending, and they're not missing a thing, even though they're not making much in the way of eye contact, right? Okay. Moving along. Okay, so allied approaches. It's not really clear what allied approaches take this same. Probably Ingersoll and Casri, but nobody talks about this. So they all kind of brush this under the rug because people don't want to hear this kind of thing. It makes you sound like you can't measure things, but you can measure things. All those people I mentioned on the previous slide, Tomasello and Liz Bates and all these people have been doing it for years, so it's doable. Okay, stage and development. So looking at this developmental approach, and I'm just going to go through this real quick because I'm assuming you guys have all had these FEDLs 42 million times by now. But this is the approach in DIR, these particular stages. Other treatments, as I said, use these developmental sorts of approaches, usually talking about developmentally appropriate practice. It's not exactly the same thing, but it's similar. Okay, it's in a similar vein. Okay, something a little more interesting. Sensation, sense, focus, sensory. These things show up in DIR, don't show up elsewhere. Different senses or different sense abilities affect input, right? We have to learn through our senses, bottom line, right? So if we have a problem with what we do with what we take in or how we take things in, that's going to affect what we do take in or what we can take in, okay? So just an obvious example, visually impaired children learn to produce different sounds in a different developmental order from sighted children because we actually use our vision to help us decide how to produce certain sounds, like P, for example. P has a nice visual indicator with your lips closing, but other sounds like K, well, there's not much there to help me figure out that that's a K. Okay, so visually impaired children produce P later than sighted children. Right? So, I mean, I don't know how much work that takes, but it's fairly obvious. There are lots and lots of studies that show there are differences in individuals with autism regarding sensory information, right? They have certain things that they find aversive, certain things that they like involving the senses, and this is now in DSM-5, right? So these sensory issues are now part of DSM-5. What's interesting, though, or what's something else to consider is why. Right? So why are there these sorts of differences, and are there any patterns in these sorts of differences? And I was really surprised that this goes back to 1949, the theory of why, where Bergman and Escalona suggested these are compensatory strategies to guard against oversensitivity. 1949, right? Kanner came out with his famous article on autism in 1943. So very shortly after that developed. Ornitz and Ritvo have the perceptual inconstancy theory that says abnormalities in perceptual integration and motility pattern. There are abnormalities, and then this leads to secondary symptoms or problems with language, social interaction, general developmental delays. So they're saying this is due to these abnormalities in sensory systems. And they even talk about a physiological problem, which they think was in the brainstem and had to do with problems with regulating stress. Children were either over-aroused or under-aroused, and this led to these sorts of problems. Kinsburn, 20 years later, extended this and said that this had to do with state regulatory issues that led to hyperfocus or repetitive movements as a compensatory strategy for over or under stimulation. Should all sound pretty familiar, right? You guys have been getting this kind of thing from DIR, right? So it goes back a very long time. Empirical findings are a little murky on this. People agree there are differences, but the differences don't follow the same pattern all the way through, which I think is something the sensory profile picks up on, right? There's not just one pattern for all children with autism. There are different patterns for children with autism. We all know that's the case, right? What's a little harder to find is evidence for the theories of why. So all these previous theories talking about why this is going on, we can't really find evidence for that. Most studies suggest there's hypo-responsiveness to stimuli, especially auditory. So if we group all the autistic kids together, that tends to be the pattern. And I think the bottom line here is that these things exist, and if we look at the pattern of results, you can interpret the results as really talking about differences, challenges, or constrictions with information processing, right? So it's not necessarily the senses themselves that are different, but it's what the kids do with that information. So they seem to have difficulties with processing sensory information, and some kids have difficulties with more difficulties with auditory, some kids have more difficulties with visual information, but it comes down to processing it. So for example, there are a lot of good studies on cross-modal stimuli, so seeing visual and auditory stimuli at the same time, and the fact that children have trouble processing those. So for example, you guys will all notice if you're watching a video and the sound is a little bit off from the person's lips moving, you notice instantly, something weird, something's going on there, right? Children with autism have trouble finding that. They have trouble finding the fact that the sound and the visual stimuli are a little bit off, right? It has to be off by more for children with autism than it does for typically developing children before they notice that there's something off. Okay, so implications for DIR, what does this mean? Well, it suggests that we do need to attend to how the child processes his or her sensory information, and we have to keep in mind that this is the conduit for input. So we have to adjust the input that's coming in to account for these differences, okay? We need to slow it down, give them more time to process what's coming in, okay? Okay, allied treatments, maybe certs to some extent. Sensory integration, maybe, although the results on sensory integration therapy are rather mixed. So more work needs to be done on this sensory piece. I do have working with a PhD student at Fielding Graduate University, and she is developing a measure about sensory interaction and parents' ability to read sensory interaction cues and adjust their way of interacting based on what they're seeing from the child. And that looks to be very promising. We haven't started running the study yet. It'll probably start next month. And then so maybe next time I talk, we can report on how that went. Okay, feelings, emotions, affect, love, and engagement. So here's the next part. This is where I think, as I mentioned before, we really start getting some distinguishing characteristics going on with DIR. Stanley talked about the affect diathesis hypothesis, and to just quote, I think this is Engaging Autism, unique biologically based processing deficit involving the connection of affect, motor planning, and sequencing activities and symbol formation. Okay? Or he says this is the core deficit in autism. It's the inability to connect affect to motor planning and symbol formation. And there's things I like about this hypothesis. I think that it's an important hypothesis, first of all, because he points us to the critical importance of affect and emotion when we're working with children with autism and when we're working with families with autism. And I don't think anybody had really pointed that out before this point. It's a really critical issue. It's hard to find research for. In fact, there is no research or there is no evidence about the fact about his suggestion that we have to have emotion in order to get any sort of learning, right? Motor planning or symbol formation words, right? There isn't any research on there. There is research, however, that emotion does help in learning, right? So if you look at the part of the brain that's responsible for emotion and memory, it's the same part of the brain as the hippocampus, right? So they're very closely spatially oriented, so it makes sense that if you use emotion and affect, you're going to get better learning. Okay? Is it critical? Well, Probably not. There's certainly children with autism who are very low emotionally on the emotional reactivity, but have still developed language and still have fairly good motor skills, right? So I don't know if there's a one-to-one correlation, but I think the main point that remains is that these emotions and affect is really important. It provides motivation. It helps us regulate mood and attention of children, right? And as I mentioned, memory and attention are really important. There's an interesting study by Esterbrook where they do, they show words in rapid succession, like show one word and then another word. And if the people miss the second word very often because they tend to blink after they get the first word, and if you blink, you miss that second word, or you miss part of the second word, and then they can't recall what it was. Their brain doesn't process it quickly enough. But if that second word is a highly charged emotional word, like a 4-letter swear word, they rarely miss it. It's really interesting, right? So there may be something about that priority of processing as well for emotionally charged situations. Emotionally charged situations, we tend to remember more detail, right? If something traumatic happens to you, you can remember every last detail about that event, right? And that probably has something to do with enhanced processing and memory associated with emotions. Don't forget the caregivers and the parents, right? I think this is a piece that is underdeveloped in the literature in DIR. I know a lot of you are not underdeveloped in your practice on this, but it's underdeveloped and undertested in the literature. The fact that DIR really attends to the mental states or the emotional states of the caregivers and other family members, this whole coaching piece and the supportive piece. And I think a lot of you talk about holding, right, when you're coaching your parents. And so one of the things that we're working on now, I'm working on with Eunice Lee, who was one of our therapists up at York University, is looking at reductions in parenting stress as a result of our DIR-based treatment. So, you know, I think this is a part that really separates DIR from other interventions, right? There are other parent-mediated interventions out there, but I don't know of any that have this almost supportive psychoanalytic approach to coaching the parents. Most of the parent-mediated interventions are instruction. Here's what you do, you know, here and then next and then next. But there's no real emotional, social emotional support going on between therapist and family. Okay, allied treatment. So DIR seems to be rather unique, although RDI, and you know, it's hard to differentiate RDI from DIR oftentimes. This may be a place where RDI seems to be the closest treatment. There are some partially or potentially allied treatments. This PACT study that I mentioned before seems to work a little bit on that. And there certainly is lots of research on the problem of stress and crises associated with parents and families with autism. But there's very, very, very little about interventions aimed at reducing that stress. How do you reduce that stress? I just can't find things. I found one tiny little study published in a Spanish journal by Magyana and colleagues, which is a psychoeducational program for parents, resulting in increases in empowerment. So they were really working on increasing the empowerment of parents. Okay, so last one then, of course, is experiment. And I think that this is used probably in a different way from I want to use it, but I think Stanley and Serena used it to mean you have to try things out when you're doing therapy. You have to experiment a little bit, see what works for each kid. Every kid is a little bit different. And so at one point, you guys all know the ABCs, right? Antecedent behavior. What's C? Consequence, thanks. There it is. Antecedent behavior, consequence. And I think that's a good place to start, but notice it leaves out all that cognitive stuff. And so I think it needs to be the A+, B+, C+, which is slightly better than just A, B, C, right? And I think those pluses have to be thinking about those cognitive components. So you need to think about the antecedents, but then think about what's going on in the child's head in terms of that antecedent. Why is that antecedent leading to this particular behavior? And what then is the consequence? And what's going on cognitively in terms of that consequence? And so I think there's a bit of experimentation going on with that. So let me finally get to the whole point of this presentation, which is to talk about evidence. So empirical, this is direct empirical, right, based evidence. So we have a number of studies that I won't really spend much time on, that these are uncontrolled studies. So these don't have a randomized control group, for example. There are chart reviews, there are single study designs. So Greenspan and Weider's chart review. Mahoney and Perales have a quasi-experimental study in which they look at pervasive developmental disorder versus children with developmental delay and are actually using DIR. And by the way, these studies that I'll mention here are DIR or DIR-related interventions, or DIR-based interventions, I should say. So anybody who says we're doing DIR or we're doing a DIR-based intervention. So Rick Solomons calls his stuff the Play Project, but it's DIR-based. And he's got a pre-post study showing improvements in measures of interaction. And then there's a recent single study designed by Dion and Martini, where they showed increases in circles of communication, so back and forth exchanges associated with DIR. Okay, so empirical evidence. So this is typically developing control group, a random assignment, sorry, not typically developing control group. I don't know why I have that in there. So this is a control group of children receiving a typical or community-based or some other type of intervention, and then DIR on the other hand, and there's random assignment to these groups. So these are true experimental studies, and I'm just presenting them in more or less chronological order. So there's this, I just call this one the Thai study because I'm afraid of butchering their names. If anybody knows how to pronounce these at some point, come up and tell me. But I'll call this the Thai study. One group received ABA, and the other group received DIR on top of ABA, and they received about 15 hours a week. This was parent-directed DIR on top of their ABA. There were 28 kids, preschool-age kids, so it's a fairly decent-sized sample. And they found significantly greater improvement in childhood autism rating scale. Functional emotional assessment scale improved as well, and the functional emotional questionnaire improved. And these are increases over the ABA-only group. So the DIR plus ABA group increased on these things over and above the ABA group. They did a follow-up study in 2012 after 1 year, and they found that after that time, 47% of the kids increased by 1.5 functional emotional developmental levels, 23 increased by 1. So what is that, 70, about 70% of the kids increased by at least 1 functional emotional developmental level after a year. Okay? Again, randomized control study, right? This is good evidence. All right. Lal and Shahabria, this was a study done in India. And I will say at the outset, this is an oddly published study. I'm not exactly sure what is going on with the study. I don't think it got well reviewed. There are lots and lots of important details missing in this study that we would like to see as researchers reported. They're not reported, so I don't know what exactly to make of this study, but here's what they found. This is a community treatment versus DIR group. They had 20 to 30-minute sessions. Doesn't say for how long those sessions went on. I think they had a total of 6. I better not say that. I'm not sure if that was this study or not. I think it was 600 hours of treatment total, but I don't remember how long that lasted. 26 kids, ages 3 to 6. They used the behavioral scale for social skills, which I don't really know, but it measures turn-taking, cause-effect, two-way communication, emotional thinking. Do you know that one, Kathy? I never heard of it either. It sounds interesting, but I've never heard of it, so I don't know how well it's normed, and they don't mention anything about the norming of it. They also don't cite it in their bibliography. And there's significantly greater overall improvement in all of these scales for the DIR group over the community treatment group, except for emotional thinking. So everything increases other than emotional thinking. And it may be that this was something that they made on their own and they're just naming it. I don't know. Again, it seems like it's a good study, but it's poorly reported. I can't figure out what's going on with the study. Okay. This is a study that we did up at York University with Stuart Shanker, Amanda Binns, Faye McGill, who's in the audience, Olga Mortar, Eunice Lee, who's also here, and Jim Steben. And we have a few different studies of different parts of this. And we did a DIR-based treatment versus a community treatment. The community treatment got mostly ABA because that's what's the norm in Ontario. although they got a smattering of some other things in addition. I will also say our treatment group got 2 hours of DIR treatment a week. The average amount of treatment that the community treatment group got was 4 hours. Okay, so they on average got 4 hours. But we are asking our families to do about 20 hours of working with their child at home. Okay, so these are 2 to 4 at the start of treatment. And we found significantly greater improvements in measures of interaction for the DIR-based group. So that included attention to activity, initiation of joint attention, involvement in activities with the parent, and then enjoyment of the interaction. We did not find a significant improvement over the ABA group for standardized measures of language. Okay, we did find pre to post there was a significant improvement in both groups, but the DIR group wasn't better than ABA, or wasn't better than the community treatment group. But you have to remember that these standardized assessments focus a lot on vocabulary and grammar and syntax. They don't focus on language use. So we did a follow-up study that was just published, and we looked at analyses of interactions and language sample during the interaction, and we found significantly better functional language for the DIR group. So that included things like the number of utterances the children produced, the length of their utterances, the number of different types of utterances, so requesting or labeling or commenting, things like that. Let's see, what am I leaving out? Length of utterance, number. Oh, contingency. Found much significantly better contingency. So did the response to parent initiation take into account what the parent said, or was it completely off topic? And so that was significantly better for the DIR group. And then we're preparing right now and getting ready to send into review a study showing significant reductions in parenting stress for the DIR group. Okay, and then 2014, Rick Solomon and a number of people, including I see Mahoney was on the study as well, did their study of play project. This is their final study of play project compared to a community treatment group. Very large N, so 128 individuals randomly assigned to either community treatment or DIR group. They got, oh, here was the 600, so take that back from the other study. 15 hours per week they got, and they found significantly greater improvements in interaction again, functional, emotional, developmental levels. Autism severity as measured by the ADOS also significantly decreased. They did, again, not find any significant improvement in language. They used the MacArthur Communicative Developmental Inventory, which only measures vocabulary and gestures. That's it. So it doesn't, again, does not measure functional language use. Okay. So I think the general picture is that we are fairly confident at this point that DIR is effective in improving functional, emotional interaction, social interaction, and things related to that functional communication and interaction. Okay, I think that's what all of this shows. There are limitations to the studies, and this has been pointed out. There's a recent review by Mercer in 2015 in like the Journal of Social Work. Something about social work was in the title of the journal. So one of the things that we don't have is a direct controlled comparison to ABA, where we actually control the ABA treatment as well as a DIR treatment. And this is pointed out by every ABA person. You could say the same thing for ABA, though, right? There are no direct comparisons between ABA and DIR. So we still don't know whether theirs is better than DIR. We don't know whether DIR is better than theirs. And many of the studies in ABA compare to a no treatment group or community intervention group. So does DIR work? Yes. Is it better than ABA? Oh, we don't know. Okay. Controlling time in treatment. So the studies comparing DIR to community treatment groups don't control for time in treatment, given the fact that we're usually training parents to do the treatment, and so they're doing 20 hours at home, and the kids in the community treatment groups probably aren't getting 20 hours at home. So even though we did in our study up at York, we did 2 hours of DIR treatment, and the kids in the community treatment group got on average 4 hours, I assume the kids in the community treatment group, their parents weren't going home and doing 20 hours of treatment with them at home. That probably was not the case. There is, with DIR, and probably will always be with DIR, possible to get around it, but it's difficult to get around it. A parent buy-in factor, in that if the parents don't understand DIR, if they think it doesn't work, or they're not willing to put the time and effort in to do DIR, it probably won't work, right? I should mention, related to this, is that if you're teaching parents to do an intervention and the parents don't have time to do that intervention, it's not going to work either, right? So there's also that factor. Mercer, in the review article, complains that there isn't independent verification, which I frankly don't understand, because we have 4 studies from 4 independent research groups. I didn't work with Rick Solomon at all on his study. He didn't work with me at all on the study. I don't know the Thai people. I've never met them. And so, these are at least 3 good studies that are independent of each other. If they mean somebody has to take our exact protocol and replicate our exact protocol, then that's probably true. But I'm not sure that happens in ABA either. Every ABA intervention is a little bit different. So I'm not sure what to do with that one. So those are our limitations. Important work ahead, and I'll finish with this. I'm sorry, I'm a few minutes over. There's a lack of agreement of what DIR is. This is really a big impediment to doing research. There's no written manual. There's no fidelity measure that everybody who's doing DIR agrees on, and we need that. We have to have that. If we want other people to do research on DIR, we've got to get that out there, okay? And we have to make it available to them, either at cost or freely available or something, but we need something out there. Even if we just publish it as a book and people can go spend $40 on the book or something, or $100 on DVDs or something, we have to do that. Now, there will be an effect, right? Because you guys all know that doing this training and hands-on training and getting mentorship, you improve as time goes on. But at least it's someplace where we can start and say, look, we've got this fidelity measure. We know they're doing it properly or they're not doing it properly. It gives us some basis for the research to work. We need more work on the parent coaching piece. As I said, there's not enough out there. It's an important piece. It's really a special part of DIR. And we need more work on the sensory OT piece. I mentioned Carrie's dissertation at Fielding. She's working on something called the sensory affective interactional attunement scale. And so we need more work on that DIR piece. Does that work or doesn't that work? We have a little bit in our study in 2013 where we show that as parents got better at the OT piece, their kids got better with interaction. But it's not great, right? It's not proof positive. We didn't modify it. Wasn't one of the things that we manipulated in our study. Okay, and that's it. So I'll finish there. And I think I'm over time, Kathy, so I don't know if you want to take a few minutes for questions or just... Okay. Yes, Ira.
One of the things that I wonder about is in our approach in DIR, when we're working with the parents and the kids, we tend to take them in together and do the work. And one of the things that I think is really essential is a parallel process that goes on, working with the parents first, developing that relationship with the parents first, and then beginning the DIR work with the parents.
Yeah.
And I'd repeat the question.
So Dr. Glavinski is asking about or commenting about, he thinks that it's really important that when we work with families with DIR, we take the parents and the child in at the same time, but he says he thinks it's really important to work with the parents first and to develop a relationship with the parent and then bring in the child after you've developed that relationship. And I agree. I think that's a really important piece. And again, I don't know of the research on it. You have to, at least not with doing DIR, at least not with doing autism treatment. There, you can appeal to psychoanalytic research and you can appeal to parental reflexive functioning research, but there's nothing specific to autism treatment that I know of, and it could be a critically important piece and is not represented in any other treatment that I know of for children with autism. Yeah, good. Other questions? Yeah? In our 2015 article, what we use to analyze these transcripts is in there. I think it's in an appendix, and it shows what we did. If anybody's interested, wants to do a study, and wants the manual that we used for coding that gives examples and things like that, we're happy to share it. You just need to send me an email. And the same thing goes for we have a fidelity measure that we used for our treatment when we did DIR, and if anybody needs to get a hold of that, we can share that as well. It's not published anywhere, and it's specific to the treatment we were doing. But I've shared that with a number of people already. Other questions? Okay, thank you very much.